My name's Gilbert Alexander Márquez. We're in Riverside at Family Housing at UCR. I'm currently employed by Old Dominion Freight Line in Rialto. I'm a replenisher, which is kind of like a cross position for like maintenance and just general warehouse. I think probably in the last few weeks, I've had to make a lot of really hard decisions because I have AFib and diabetes and conditions that put me at risk that if I were to contract COVID, that I don't have a very good likelihood of surviving it. And so I was really concerned because a lot of the stuff I was seeing at work as far as putting anything in place was always behind. So where like quarantine started, like we really didn't have anything in place to deal with that. I think in February, I was going to like Home Depot to buy like better PPE because the PPE they were providing like was, I would consider it substandard. So it really started to concern me as like as we entered into April and March, because I wasn't able to get the PPE just for my job, because at my job we're handling a lot of trash and a lot of pathogens, and a lot of the stuff that's in the dumpsters and the trash barrels. As a worker, like as a maintenance worker, we're not able to identify a lot of that stuff. Also, the exhaust from the propane that runs the forklifts, and the dust and the just general warehouse like particulate air, like contamination. So going into it, I was already looking for better PPE, but as we got into the crisis, it was harder to get access to it just at the job site because I was concerned. Like I didn't know if my AFib and diabetes put me at risk, but when my wife had to go to the emergency room, she came down with symptoms. So she was feverish and she was achy and had flu-like symptoms. And we were really concerned because it came on really fast. We called the emergency and they were like, come in. So we had to take my wife to the emergency room. And while she was there, and they were questioning her, and then they asked her what I did for a living, and like, oh, my husband works in the warehouse, but should he be working? And she's like, he has AFib and he has health conditions. And the doctor told her like he shouldn't be working. He should be sheltering in place because he's very at risk. Right? So that concerned me. Over the last few weeks, as things became more and more serious, that was on my mind. And I started to just kind of put together that, my employer is slow to react. I'm in a position where I don't really get any direct communication from management, and that I needed to make that decision for myself and my family's safety, because going to work and being exposed to a lot of pathogens and materials, and then not having the physical distancing, I was trying to make a decision based on limited information, and I couldn't trust that my employer was making decisions in my, with regards to me. I think that they were doing things to protect themselves, but really not myself or other workers. Since before coronavirus was considered a crisis and then the pandemic, these were things that were on my mind that I'm like, we need better PPE. We need a better particulate mask and respirators, because that's a majority of my job. I was exposed to these things. I was under more pressure to ask for better PPE than to ask for like medical leave or time off. But then when I did ask for better PPE, I didn't really get a very good response. They were just, instead of having access to PPE, they're like, well, come and see me every day and I'll give you one mask, right? And I'm like, well, the kind of work we do, like we're handling trash and in different environments, like one mask isn't going to cut it. I asked them if we could get dedicated PPE, because in that facility, there's like up to 700 workers, and we were sharing PPE. So we were sharing protective gloves, like the rubberized gloves, the winterized ones. We're sharing face shields. And as the COVID crisis and an endemic came to be really prominent here, I was like, we can't be sharing that stuff because we also didn't have access to anything to sanitize those things. Like I had asked for that, and it really wasn't, they didn't really respond. For the most part, they were told that to be grateful because that we were still open and that we were going to continue working through it. And that was like with the dock workers. With the drivers, I think the drivers are getting a little bit more information because one of the driver conversations with the drivers I had, they were told that they were essential, but that the company was directly told by the government that not to worry about going over. I guess there's a lot of regulation for drivers that they can't drive a certain amount of hours or miles without a rest break or like an 8-hour sleep period. And that they were told to not worry about that they were going to overlook any kind of violations or things like that. But I think that the urgency of what was happening was expressed more to them because they were more in contact with the public, whereas the dock workers just come to the facility and we just interact with each other. But there was a lot of concern because we weren't required to wear a mask for gloves. The latex and nitrile gloves weren't made available, and then because of the shortage and the demand for like the medical profession, we started getting different material gloves, and they weren't always accessible, which is why I had to go to HR and be like, I'm running out of my personal supply of gloves. There's none available at the stores. So like, you need to provide this in order for me to do my job. Otherwise, like, I can't do this job. I think that there was a distrust of the company with some of my coworkers. There was a distrust for the company to fully communicate that they were worried, right? I mean, it's pretty much the attitude of management and the company has been just like business as usual with the occasional update of like, this is where we're at. If you're sick, don't come to work. And this is before this is before everything. This is when I was hired in November. But he's like, if you're sick, don't come to work. But if you got the sniffles or a cough, we're all men here, so you got to do what you got to do. During our hiring and our orientation, like our company specifically touted the fact that we're a non-union shop and this is the history of the company. And part of the orientation, like the film, was like, oh, this is a family business. It's been around since World War II, and we've benefited from deregulation. We are one of the best employers because we offer so many things to our workers, and this is specifically because we are a non-union shop, and we want to keep it a non-union shop. And I've never really worked at a company that's been part of the like orientation. It was very much part of the company culture, because as I was a new hire and just started working, like a lot of the more established workers would be like, oh, this is a great company. But the talking point was always that they returned to was like, we can only do this because this is a non-union shop. A lot of my jobs when I was younger, I was directly hired to a company. I was a company employee. I was more able to find full-time work. And then after the recession, it was just a matter of you had to go through temp agencies, and it was more temporary work and it was less protected. And so what I'm seeing now, like in my experience with this company, is that as a part-time worker, I felt very much left in the wind because I wasn't able to get benefits. Wow, I'm employed, but it's this kind of form of like second-class citizenship where you still have to depend, like we still were getting CalFresh and EBT and still having to depend on various things to help us like survive. I was like, I've been struggling. I was a student for the last 6 years, so I've been poor. I was poor before I returned to school, and now I'm in the workforce again, and I'm still poor. Like, I'm not, like, we all work for the same company, but my status very much dictates that, I'm still struggling, and it felt like I couldn't communicate that with my coworkers. Is like, I can't, I don't, it's harder for me to afford PPE. So I really, looking back on my experience, like my working experience, and I've learned a lot about, so I grew up in the San Gabriel Valley. I was raised in like La Puente and El Monte, and I'm looking at like my family's experience and my experience. Like, my dad worked in a foundry. My mom was a seamstress for most of her adult life. And just living in that whole logistics corridor, right down the railroad tracks. Like, everywhere I've lived, I've always been within proximity of those railroad tracks, from Long Beach all the way up to Los Angeles and then San Gabriel. And now that I'm out in the Inland Empire, like, I'm getting a bigger sense of like what logistics is and how big it is, and connecting from like the LA International Harbor and Long Beach and San Pedro, and being here in the Inland Empire and learning about, the impact of like warehouses and logistics out here. Like, yeah, I very much want to get involved, because I'm putting all these things together. I'm putting the things that I'm learning together with my own personal experience, my family's experience, and realizing that we can't leave these things to be decided by corporations and outside entities. And I think I realized that, especially with this relationship with my new company that I'm employed with. They're based out of North Carolina, right? And so all the home offices and everything, like our credit union and everything, is based out of North Carolina. And we're in California. The labor that they're hiring and that's spending money here, that's not, it's not local. It's very much like extracting, not just our labor, but just the surrounding, all the impacts of the surround, like the environment and local businesses and housing. They're all connected, and I'm really kind of drawing on my personal experiences and my family's experience, and wanting to be involved. But I really want to be involved on a level with the worker, being on the ground level and seeing it with my own eyes. Like, I'm seeing, especially dealing with trash, like being a janitor and being in maintenance, like, you see the amount of waste that we make on a daily basis. Just graduated in June. I just got my bachelor's. So I was applying for grant writing internships and local, like, city jobs. Nothing panned out. I didn't think I would have to go back to that line of work that I had done most of my young life. And now, kind of having that ability to look at things critically, and having a longer analysis, I was like, we got involved with the local coalitions and labor that were talking about the airport, right? About the expansion of logistics. And that kind of brought that into my way of thinking about, well, it isn't just enough to have jobs. We need to have good jobs, right? Because there's already a tremendous lack of housing, and we need good jobs. And then we need there to be more accountability with the environment. One of the things that we were noticing just from driving back and forth and being in the area and learning the area was like, there's a lot of warehouses that aren't being used. There was brand new warehouses being built that were being put up within a matter of like 3 months. There's all these other abandoned warehouses that aren't being used and are neglected. And not just that they could be used, but that they're still impacting the environment. They're still contaminated. They're being ignored because they're no longer useful. The local government is saying, hey, this is we're going to have jobs. I'm like, yeah, but what about these other projects that are kind of abandoned? How do we voice these concerns? right? We have to be accountable for ourselves. But what happens to the people that don't have the luxury or the privilege to make those decisions? Yeah, what happens to the workers that have to work no matter what? I've kind of worked the like warehouse jobs and logistics and retail, but then while I was in school and doing history and Chicano studies, I'm like, this is everything that my family's gone through. Amazon's visible. And I think that that's one of the things that I was considering, like, who do I work for? You know, and trying to investigate the company, they do a very good job of not being visible, right? Not even just within the community, but like they've been cited for pollution, but it's been so hidden and so like kept out of the public eye that I'm like, that means something. You know, Amazon's a big target, but there's all these other corporations out here that are flying under the radar.